Steve Harvey had no idea his life was about to change when he stepped onto his studio stage that morning, dressed in his signature suit, smile wide and energy high. He greeted the cheering audience and began the show with one of his favorite topics, the power of purpose. He spoke about the trials of growing up poor in Cleveland, sleeping in cars, fighting to be heard, and trusting a calling even when no one else saw it. But just as he finished sharing a heartfelt moment, a production assistant rushed across the set and leaned in close to whisper something urgent in his ear. Steve's smile faded, his brows furrowed. Then, silence. He turned back to the audience and the camera. "Ah, folks," he said slowly, his voice shaking slightly. "I've just been told there's a message for me, and it's from someone I never expected." The screen behind him lit up. A seal appeared, gold and proud. The words beneath it stunned the entire room. "Message from President Ibrahim Diallo, Burkina Faso." Gasps echoed across the studio. Steve sat down, visibly rattled. I don't even know what this is about," he said softly, eyes locked on the screen. The message began. There, sitting at a modest wooden desk in a quiet room, was President Diallo, a strong man with a calm voice and eyes that seemed to hold generations of stories. Behind him fluttered the flag of his nation. "Mr. Steve Harvey," the president said in clear, heartfelt English, "I speak to you not just as a leader but as a brother." Steve leaned forward in his seat. "You don't know me, but in my country we know you. In the hills and fields, in our villages and cities your voice has reached our hearts. Your words of resilience, faith, and second chances, they've lit torches in dark places." Steve blinked, stunned. The camera caught the tremble in his hands. "During our darkest times, when war threatened our peace," the president continued, "your story gave me hope. Not as a politician but as a man, a boy, really, one who once had nothing." The room had fallen into utter silence. Even the audience dared not breathe. President Diallo looked directly into the camera. "You reminded me that leadership is not about power, it's about heart. That rising from nothing doesn't make you small, it makes you strong." Steve bit his lip, visibly fighting tears. "This message is not political," Diallo said. "It is personal. From a barefoot child in a dusty village, to a comedian who once slept in a car. I thank you." Steve covered his mouth, overcome. "I have seen you cry for others," the president continued. "I have watched you uplift strangers, share your truth, give when no one was watching. In my homeland, we call that a heart of the sun, one that gives light even when it burns itself." A tissue box slid into frame as Steve wiped his eyes. Then came the moment that no one expected. "This is not just to thank you," Diallo said. "It's to invite you. You once said you wanted to see Africa, not through the lens of fame but as a brother. I invite you to Burkina Faso not for the cameras, but for the children whose lives your voice has touched." The screen faded to black. The lights came back up. The audience was crying. Some silently wiped their faces. Even the crew behind the cameras stood frozen. Steve didn't speak. He could, single quotes T. Then, slowly, he looked into the camera and said, voice trembling, "You try to be real, just try to help. You never know who's listening." Backstage, the producers debated cutting to a commercial break. Steve shook his head. "No," he said, "let the world hear this." Just as the crew steadied themselves, the screen behind him flickered again, but this time, it wasn't a recording. President Diallo appeared live. "Mr. Harvey," he said, smiling warmly, "for once, let me speak to you not as a president to a celebrity but man to man, from one dreamer to another." The room froze again. This wasn't just a televised exchange, it was something deeper and written, unscripted. "Soul to soul, I grew up with no shoes," Diallo began, "tying my books with string, walking miles to school on an empty stomach. I've seen war, I've seen people give up, and I've seen others rise." Steve bowed his head, silent tears falling. "One day," the president continued, "in a small internet cafe, I saw a video of you. You were crying while speaking. I didn't understand all the words, but I felt your pain. I felt your hope. That day, a boy in Burkina Faso believed he could become more than his pain. That boy was me." The crowd gasped. Steve's shoulders shook. "And so, when I heard your voice again last week," Diallo said gently, "I knew I had to answer back." Steve stood slowly, every word hitting like a wave, and then Diallo delivered the sentence that would change everything. "There, is an orphanage in Ouagadougou, he said. The children there know your name. They laugh at your jokes. They pray with your words, and they believe, because you believed. A long pause. Then, I would be honored, if you came to meet them. Steve nodded slowly, eyes wet but determined. This wasn't just a message. This was a calling. And it had only just begun. Steve Harvey didn't sleep that night, even after the cameras stopped rolling and the audience had gone home. The words of President Diallo echoed in his ears. He sat alone in his dressing room, still holding the tissue he had used to wipe away tears. A producer knocked gently and handed him a printed copy of the full message. Tucked into the packet was a translation of the final line spoken in the president's native tongue. Even the strongest man, it read, needs to be reminded that his voice still matters. Steve whispered the words aloud, barely able to finish the sentence. He wasn't thinking about television ratings, sponsors, or trending hashtags. None of that mattered anymore. Something deeper had shifted inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just admiration or shock, it was a sense of calling. By morning, his assistant found him at his desk, phone in hand, eyes tired but resolute. Get me a line to Ouagadougou, he said. I want to speak to President Diallo today. 2 hours later, a secure video link was set up the screen. Linked in there he was, President Ibrahim Diallo.com, and sincere, dressed simply in a crisp white shirt. His smile wasn't for show. It was warm, familiar, almost familial. Mr. Harvey, he said, I'm honored. You reached out. Steve leaned forward. Mr. President, I'm just a comedian from Cleveland. I never imagined my voice would reach someone like you. Diallo nodded, and I was just a boy without shoes. But hope has a way of traveling farther than feet ever could. Steve fell quiet. Then the president said something that shook him again. There's someone I want you to meet. Who? Steve asked. You'll know when you see her, Diallo replied. Come to Burkina Faso, not for the world, for yourself. And just like that, the decision was made. Steve turned down every press request. He didn't want this to be a spectacle. No entourage, no cameras, just him, a translator, and a single journal he hadn't opened in years. As the plane crossed the Atlantic, he stared out the window, thinking about his childhood. The nights they went hungry, the hand-me-down clothes, the silence when he cried and no one answered, and now he was flying halfway across the world because his pain had somehow sparked someone else's purpose. He pressed the journal to his chest. He whispered, God, why me? But somewhere deep down, he already knew. When the plane landed on a dusty runway in Burkina Faso, there were no reporters waiting, no banners, no grand ceremony, just a few local guards, 2 smiling translators, and a young woman holding a sign that read, Welcome home, Brother Steve. As he stepped into the warm, golden sun, Steve felt his heart thud against his chest. He was driven through humble streets. Children waved at the van, some of them barefoot, some holding pieces of paper with his name scrawled in bright markers. But nothing could prepare him for what he saw at the gates of the orphanage. Over 100 children had gathered. Handmade signs fluttered in the breeze. You matter. Thank you, Mr. Steve. We love you. Steve stepped out slowly. His knees felt weak. And then President Diallo emerged, not in formal attire, but in a simple, traditional tunic, arms open wide. He embraced Steve tightly. Welcome home, he said. Steve couldn't speak. His throat closed, his eyes already misting over. Then came a voice, small, soft, uncertain. Steve. He turned. From the crowd stepped a little girl, no more than 10 years old. She was barefoot, wearing a pale blue dress, slightly too big for her. In her trembling hands was a thin notebook, bound with string. Her eyes, large and searching, locked onto his. My name is Acha, she whispered. This is for you. She held out the notebook. Steve knelt down, hands trembling, and took it. Inside was a letter. Dear Mr. Steve, my name is Acha. My papa died 2 years ago. My mama is very sick. Some nights I cry and nobody knows. One day, someone played your video. You said you were born to do something great. I believed you. I think maybe I was born for something too. Thank you for making us feel seen. I hope you smile when you see us. Your little sister Acha. Steve closed the notebook and wept. Openly. Rawly. The kind of tears that shake your soul. Acha reached out and gently touched his cheek. The children stood silently behind her, watching this man they had only seen on cracked phone screens, now kneeling before them, just as human, just as broken, and just as loved. President Diallo stood nearby, his hands clasped. "She wrote that before I even contacted you," he said. "She didn't know if you'd come, but she believed." Steve stood, eyes wet, voice shaking. "I didn't know if I mattered like this," he said. "Not until now." The children began to sing softly, a simple local song about hope. No instruments, no microphones, just innocent voices rising into the African sky. Steve didn't understand the words, but he felt every single one. The sun was still rising over Ouagadougou when President Diallo invited Steve for a drive, not to a palace, not to a press event, but to a market. "This," Diallo said as the car pulled up to a narrow, dusty street, "is where I first heard your voice." Steve looked out the window. There was nothing glamorous about the place, just rows of wooden stalls covered with tattered cloth, baskets of fruit, jars of spices, worn tables. Women shouted prices. Children ran between stalls. The scent of earth and fire lingered in the air. They walked through the market quietly, nodding at locals who paused to smile but didn't swarm. It wasn't celebrity here. It was something deeper. Respect. President Diallo led him to the very back of the market. There, half buried in dust and memories, stood a collapsed wooden table with a bent metal pole beside it. "This was my grandmother's stall," he said, his voice almost reverent. "Right here. I used to crouch under this table and help her count coins. One day, a man brought a radio. Your voice came through it, broken, but strong." Steve placed a hand on the broken wood, as if touching history itself. "I didn't understand your language," Diallo continued. "But I understood the laugh, the tears, the truth. My grandmother couldn't read or write, but when she heard your voice, she smiled like someone had remembered her." Steve turned away, blinking back tears. The president bent down, picked up a smooth rock from the dirt, and placed it in Steve's palm. "This is where hope began," he said softly. "Right here. Not in a castle, not in a speech, but beneath this table, with your voice carrying across oceans." Steve nodded slowly, then fell into an unexpected silence, the kind that only comes when you realize you've impacted lives you never knew existed. Their next stop was a small village, about an hour outside the capital. The road was bumpy, surrounded by fields and palm trees. Steve sat in silence most of the way, still clutching the stone. When they arrived, a group of women waited under a wide mango tree. One woman stepped forward, her frame fragile but dignified. Her name was Awa. "She used to sit beside my grandmother during market days," President Diallo explained. "She's the last one still alive who remembers those mornings. She remembers your voice." Steve looked confused. "How?" "They didn't understand English," Diallo smiled. "Sometimes, you don't need words. Awa used to say, 'That man has a heart that speaks louder than his tongue.'" A translator stepped forward as Awa slowly approached. Her hands trembled as she placed one gently on Steve's cheek. She spoke in Moor, the regional language. The translator's voice cracked as he whispered. She said, "My sister would have fed you if she had met you. She would have called you her son." Steve dropped to his knees. He wasn't Steve Harvey, the entertainer, anymore. He was a son being welcomed home by a mother he had never known he needed. He cried, and Owa, without a word, pulled him gently into her arms. The next stop was a tiny school on the edge of the village. No more than 3 rooms with chalkboard, walls and plastic chairs. Inside, children waited quietly, nervous but excited. There were no stage lights, no fancy microphones, just them, and a small group of drums. As Steve entered, they began to sing. It wasn't a song he recognized, but it felt hauntingly familiar. The melody was soft, rhythmic, full of soul. That the translator leaned in. "It's a song President Diallo's grandmother used to hum while cooking. Now these children sing it in her memory." Steve froze. His hands trembled. "I remember this," he whispered. "My grandmother in Cleveland. She used to hum something like this when I cried." President Diallo stood beside him, arms crossed, nodding gently. "Our grandmothers," he said, "they gave us the same comfort thousands of miles apart." Steve sat on a wooden bench, surrounded by children. A little girl with wide eyes and a shy smile handed him a carved wooden figure, 2 hands holding a heart. It was simple, but it undid him. Years of pain, grief, and questions unraveled in that moment. He wept, gnashing and full-hearted, the boy from Cleveland, the boy from Ouagadougou, two men standing in the light of the women who raised them, brought together not by fame, but by the ache of shared history. The room didn't see celebrities anymore, just sons who missed their grandmothers, just men who had found healing in a place no map could ever mark, and in that silence, something beautiful bloomed. Before Steve Harvey boarded his return flight, President Ibrahim Diallo made one final request. "There's something I want to show you," he said. They drove without a convoy, no flags, no armed guards, just two men and a driver on a winding, dirt road that led to a quiet plot of land just outside the city. At the center stood a tall baobab tree, its branches stretching wide like open arms. Beneath it, a ring of sunflowers danced gently in the morning breeze. Steve stepped out of the car, the weight of the last few days pressing on him like a sacred burden. "This land," the president said, handing him a small scroll tied in red ribbon, "now belongs to you." Steve stared, stunned. "I didn't come here for a gift," he replied softly. Diallo smiled. "You came because a little girl believed you would. Because your voice raised a village before your feet ever touched its soil." Steve looked down at the scroll, then up at the old tree. "It's a place of peace," the president continued. "Whenever life grows heavy, you can return here. You are always welcome, not as a guest, but as family." Steve swallowed hard, his voice catching. "I gave everything I had to survive back then," he said, "but I never knew it would come back like this." Diallo stepped closer and did something unexpected. He knelt, one knee in the dirt, head bowed. He placed a hand gently on Steve's chest. "I do not kneel for power," he said, "but I kneel for hearts that change lives." Steve stared down, overwhelmed, and slowly dropped to his knees as well. No speeches, no music, just two grown men, kneeling in silence beneath the African sun. One, a boy from Cleveland. The other, a barefoot child who became a president. Both of them held together by invisible threads of loss, hope, and something bigger than either of them. A few moments later, Steve turned toward the tree and whispered, "Thank you, Mama. I made it." Later that day, as Steve prepared to leave, President Diallo handed him one last gift. It wasn't a plaque or medal. It was a folded paper, old and worn at the edges. It was a copy of H's letter, the original she had written in that tattered notebook. "She asked if you would read it again," Diallo said. "She wanted to be sure you knew. She meant every word." Steve smiled and pressed the paper to his heart. "I believe her," he said. At the airport, there were no cameras. Waiting, that was Steve's request. He didn't want this moment commodified. Some things are too holy to package. Before stepping onto the plane, he turned around one last time. On a small hill overlooking the runway stood Akka. She waved with both hands, her notebook still tucked under her arm. A teacher stood beside her. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Steve raised a hand and waved back, mouthing the words, "Thank you." The flight home felt different. He didn't review show notes or scroll through emails. He simply sat with his thoughts, the carved wooden figure resting in his lap, one of two hands holding a heart. He opened his old journal and began to write for the first time in years. First words were simple. "I came looking for answers, and found a mirror instead." When he returned to the States, Steve asked the network for a quiet segment. No applause, no interviews, just 5 minutes of airtime. That week, he walked onto his set not as a host, but as a man changed. He placed the carved figure gently on his desk and looked into the camera. "In my life," he began, "I've received many awards, but none like this." He held up H's letter. "I met a child who believes in her future, because she heard someone like me once believed in his. I met a president who reminded me that pain doesn't cancel purpose. It fuels it." His voice cracked, and I remembered my mother. I remembered who I used to be when nobody saw me, and how powerful it is when someone finally does. Then, Steve reached under the desk and pulled out a small audio speaker. He hit play. The studio filled with the sound of children singing Acha's class, recorded from that school in the village. No English, no subtitles, just purity, just heart. Audience cried, not because they understood the words, but because they felt them. Comments flooded in. "I'm not crying, you are. This is what the world needs. Healed." Steve ended the segment simply. "Somewhere out there," he said, "a child is listening to your voice. Make sure what they hear gives them hope." Then he stood and walked off stage, not as a star, but as a son of the same soil.